Okay, hello everyone. Today we're going to move our focus a little bit away from last class. If you remember last class, we discussed the creation of a European-dominated Indian Ocean and Far Eastern trading network. We saw how first the Portuguese and then later the Dutch and the English came into the Indian Ocean and parts of the Far East and were able to establish kind of dominant trading positions there that allowed them to move products all around the world. And as we also highlighted in that class, we saw that one of the main kind of trading items, if you want to put it that way, that undergirded this entire system was the movement of enslaved peoples from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. And so today I want to actually focus a little bit more on that to see how slavery not only underpinned this entire economy, but how the economic importance of slavery helped to change people's perceptions of their common humanity and of race. So the key questions that we want to look at today are: how is the profitability of slavery tied to moral complicity? How did the racial elements of slavery develop over time in North America? And why did these changes occur? So, as we saw, slavery, the movement of enslaved people, the use of enslaved people in the Atlantic economy is not just an isolated thing. It's not just in the Caribbean or just in South America or just in the southern states of North America, but the economies of all different parts of the world are actually connected with this, touching it. So, as we look at the development of slavery today, it's easy to get kind of lost in some of these big questions and big issues of victimhood and the suffering of people and things like that. And I don't want to minimize that, and I don't want to actually skip over that. In fact, we'll talk more about that on Friday when we read aloud Equiano. But one of the things that I want us to pay particular attention to today is how the economic importance of slavery actually helps people, or I shouldn't say helps people, it actually convinces people to come up with moral justifications for what they're doing, right? Because first and foremost, we have to remember that slavery is incredibly profitable. As I just said, people all over this network of trade are making money off of this. Even if they're not directly connected to slavery, even if they themselves don't ever see a slave or ever own a slave, people in London are making money off of this. People in West Africa are making money off of this. People in the New World are making money off of this. And if you include some of the products that are being brought from India and from China that are being exchanged for slaves, you could even argue that people in India and China are making money off of this. So, with so much money being made off of this, it's no wonder that people start to shift their views in order to kind of make themselves feel morally better about all of this. So here on the screen are two advertisements that actually come from this time period. They're both from what today would be called the United States, and they both are advertising an auction to be held for African people who've just arrived. And if you read over these, to be sold on board the ship Bance Island on Tuesday the 6th of May next at Ashley Ferry, a choice cargo of about 250 fine, healthy Negroes just arrived from the Windward and Rice Coast. The utmost care has already been taken and shall be continued to keep them free from the least danger of being infected with the smallpox. No boat having been on board or any other communication with people from Charlestown prevented. And over on the next one, to be sold on Thursday, the 3rd day of August next, a cargo of 94 prime, healthy Negroes consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls. If you look at this, how are they describing these people? They're using terms and terminology that would be commonly associated with selling an animal, right? Selling a cow or selling a horse or something like that. And so you can see, even in these advertisements, that people are beginning to dehumanize one another. And this brings up a very important point, because it's not just profitability that is changing, right? It's also people's morality. People are morally complicit in this. And there's no one involved in this, even tangentially, that can deny knowledge of what slavery is. I showed this image last week of this sugar bowl with a slave standing behind it. This is something that somebody would have proudly displayed on their table, probably in England or maybe in France. They would have their friends over for tea and serve them sugar out of this sugar bowl that, proudly shows this happy slave providing a basket full of sugar to them, right? So people understand, people know, people have an idea of where these products are coming from. They know about slavery. So the question therefore becomes, how do people justify it? How do people make themselves okay with the fact that their prosperity is based on the suffering of their fellow human beings? Well, this is a very difficult question, and it's a difficult question that gets even more difficult when you see how many different people are involved in this. We have, heroes of liberty like John Locke, the great political philosopher who penned or coined the term, that the purpose of government is to defend our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, right? This guy who's going to be kind of the inspiration for the American Revolution to fight for freedom. Well, John Locke also wrote the Constitution of South Carolina, which enshrined the concept of slavery. We already talked about John Whitfield, the great missionary, or George Whitfield, the great missionary. He himself bought slaves to operate his orphanage in Georgia. I mean, people who otherwise, are defenders of human freedom are complicit in this. So this raises some really difficult questions. And last but not least, we have the issue of how these things come together. People are morally complicit, but people are afraid to lose this huge economic asset that is slavery. So how then do you sleep at night? Well, you create an idea that somehow these people are different than you. Somehow these people are inferior to you. Somehow these people are other. What this does, therefore, is it allows people to dehumanize one another and thus view them as something different. If you are being horrible to an African person, you're not being horrible to a fellow man. You're being horrible to something different than you. You're being horrible to something more akin to an animal or something like that, right? This allows people to actually, deal with the kind of guilt that would come from this terrible treatment. Now, the problem with this, obviously, is that these people aren't animals. They're fellow human beings. And this creates a situation where the treatment of slaves becomes harsher and harsher and harsher as the justification becomes more and more brutal. A good example of this is this picture that's demonstrated here. If you remember, I talked about how insurance companies would insure the cargoes of these ships, the cargoes being slaves. Well, in one particularly egregious example, the slave ship known as the Zong was actually on a voyage and disease broke out amongst its slaves, and many of the slaves were getting sick. Now, even those slaves that survived were not going to be worth very much by the time they got to the New World because they were all sick and ill and weak. And so the captain of the Zong developed this idea that basically if they just threw all the slaves overboard, they could collect their insurance money on them. The insurance did not compensate you if your slaves were sick and you couldn't sell them, but they did compensate you if your slaves were lost at sea. So about 180 slaves were thrown overboard by the crew of this ship and drowned on purpose. Now, the crew and captain of the Zong were put on trial for this crime, but not for murder. they were put on trial for insurance fraud. So this shows you a little bit about the kind of mentality that's taking place, that's shaping the way people view this institution of slavery. Now, we've already seen a little bit in this class about where slavery, transatlantic slavery comes from, how it develops, and how it's intimately connected into these different trading networks. As you probably remember, we talked about how it began first with the Portuguese in their kind of colonies just off the coast of Africa in order to kind of fill a labor supply gap. Well, this trade with West Africa is going to become increasingly important, and it's going to lead to the beginning of this evolution. I like using this image here because we can see kind of how West Africa is tied into this slave system. Just in this picture, we have a French slave trader negotiating with a king or a chief of some sort in West Africa. And as you look in his mouth, he's smoking tobacco, a product from the New World. He's wearing a cotton kind of tunic, which probably comes from India. These products from around the world coming together for the purchase of slaves. Well, the advent of slavery in the New World, if you remember, comes from this encomienda system that the Spanish actually employ in the New World to reward their soldiers. When their native slaves began to die or run away, they replaced them with African slaves from the Portuguese. Now, this trade between the Portuguese and the Spanish becomes so profitable and so important that the Spanish actually even grant the Portuguese something known as the asiento. This is basically a monopoly on the ability to trade slaves. This is so lucrative and so profitable that the asiento becomes a major pawn in international relations. In fact, the Dutch and the English begin to try to horn in on this trade, realizing its full potential in the late 1500s. Spain and Portugal actually briefly merged together into one country, and the English and Dutch argued, therefore, that they should be allowed to trade slaves as well. This is part of what leads to the Battle of the Spanish Armada and all sorts of other things. Well, as we begin to move onward, the slave trade obviously begins to grow in size. As more and more people move to the New World, the demand for slaves increases and the numbers begin to increase as well. It's not surprising, therefore, that beginning to strike agreements with West Africans and being able to form your own slave trading routes will be something that many Europeans want to get in on. As I said, Dutch and English pirates begin this in the 1580s and 1590s, but pretty soon this becomes pretty regularized in the 1600s. Here we have an actual written agreement between Dutch and African slavers for the purchase of slaves and their transportation to the New World. In fact, it's the Dutch who actually bring the very first cargo of African slaves to the English-speaking New World. In 1619, a slave ship run by Dutch sailors arrives at Jamestown in Virginia, and the first crew of African slaves is actually sold to English colonists then. Now, as you can see from this graph here, the slave trade begins relatively modestly in the 1500s, and that's more to do with the fact that there's not really that many Europeans over in the New World yet. As the population grows in the New World of white Europeans, actually, which is also directly connected to the fact that slavery is making living in the New World so profitable, you have this kind of gradual growth in the amount of slaves being traded across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, as you can imagine, the more and more and more of this that happens, the more lucrative it becomes, the more desirable it becomes for other Europeans to actually become involved. Well, if you notice, around the year 1700, there's a pretty big spike in the amount of slaves being traded. And that's due in large part to the fact that the British by this point, win a major international war. In the year 1713, They win this war, and one of the things that they ask for in the peace treaty that ends this war back in Europe is not land, it's not territories, not colonies or anything like that. They demand that the Spanish grant them the asiento, this monopoly to be able to sell slaves in the New World. And so you can see how lucrative this slave trading business is, that in winning a major international war, the English actually ask for the monopoly instead of asking for a province or a territory or even monetary compensation. This is prime lucrative business, and as you can see, it expands quite rapidly after that. The little dips in these huge expansions usually are associated with major international wars, because during major international wars, slave trading ships can be raided by the opponent, by the enemy. So as you can see, slavery and slave trading is actually a major geopolitical issue as well as an economic issue. Now, despite the fact that slavery is very important for many of these European countries operating colonies and things like that, despite the fact that it's very lucrative, it doesn't look the same everywhere you go at first. While the Spanish and the Portuguese employ a relatively brutal system of slavery early on, they're not all that typical. The idea that we have in our minds of slavery, of people being owned like animals, of being abused, of being whipped and chained and things like that, doesn't develop right away in many parts of the Atlantic world. Although the Portuguese and the Spanish are pretty brutal early on, as I said. The interesting thing is that many other slave trading countries, such as England, such as France, such as the Netherlands, don't really have this same conception of slavery right away. In fact, in the case of the English, they don't even really have any legal definition for slavery at first. Medieval England and early modern England didn't really have the concept of slavery. In fact, the only slaves that existed in medieval and early modern England were people who were captured in war against, usually against Muslim powers in the Mediterranean, things like that. And those people would be granted their freedom if they converted to Christianity. So it was very rare for there to be a slave in England. And because of this, many English people didn't really have a conception of the fact that you could own another person as a piece of property. In fact, what was much more common early on, in the early 1600s at least, was this idea of indentured servitude. What this basically meant was that a poor person could actually sign a contract with a wealthier patron, a boss, if you will, to work for this person for a certain number of years in exchange for some benefit at the end. Many times back in England, this would take the shape of someone signing a contract to work for someone for 7 years in exchange for being trained in a particular profession or something like that. And in the New World, this had been operated from the earliest days of English colonization in a way that people could sign up to go to Virginia or to Massachusetts or something like that. Their kind of future employer would pay for their voyage to come over, and this person would work for them for usually between 5 to 7 years. And at the end, their employer would give them tools and would give them land. In Virginia, it was about 40 acres of land. So you would get enough land to actually become a farmer on your own. So this is a pretty good deal, right? You work for 7 years for this person, and in the end, you can establish yourself as an independent landowner. Now, this is very common and something that the English were quite familiar with. And so it's probably not that surprising that when this first shipload of slaves arrives in 1619 in Virginia, this is exactly how the English treat these African people. They don't view them as property right away. They sign them up to these contracts, just like a white English person would be. Now, this leads to a very interesting example of how this whole process can actually operate. Here in Virginia, as you can see, there is a lot of land and people need laborers. And so these first slaves that are brought in 1619 are supplemented by another group in 1620. And these people are eagerly snapped up by the English landowners. But as I said, they're not snapped up as property, they're snapped up as indentured servants. Well, what does this mean? This means that at the end of their 7 years, these black indentured servants are going to be freed and given land, just like their white contemporaries will be. So as you can see, early on in the early 1600s, the English are treating African people pretty much the same as they would treat a poor white English person. And we actually have a really good example of how this works in the life story of a black African man named Anthony Johnson. Now, we don't know for sure, but it's likely that Anthony Johnson actually came over on that first shipload of Africans in 1619. If he didn't, he came on one of the ones that came shortly thereafter. So basically, Anthony Johnson is one of the very first African men in North America. Now, we know a little bit about his story because he shows up in legal records. One of the interesting things is that by about 1625 or 1630, Anthony Johnson is a free man. He's completed his indentured servitude, and he is now a free man. He's actually gets married to another African woman who herself has been freed after her indentured servitude, and they become landowners. There's actually legal records of Anthony Johnson owning his 40 acres of land, and in fact acquiring even more land. By about 1640, Anthony Johnson has enough land that he himself begins to hire indentured servants. So think about this. This guy is a freed black slave in essence, and now he's a major prosperous landowner in Virginia. He's actually owning or operating his own indentured servants and becoming a very prosperous individual. Now, things are actually beginning to change a little bit, unfortunately, because as the colony of Virginia begins to become more and more successful, more and more prosperous with the growth of tobacco and other things like that, people begin to actually see the value of keeping Africans as property rather than as indentured servants. If you think about it, it's relatively expensive to actually have to give all of these indentured servants tools and land at the end of their 7 years. Wouldn't it make a lot more sense to actually just be able to kind of keep these people? Well, this process begins to occur very gradually. In the year 1641, 3 indentured servants actually escape from Virginia and make their way up to Maryland. They're all caught. 2 of these guys are white, and the court punishes them by tacking on an extra 5 years for their indentured servitude. But one of these guys that runs away is black, and his name is John Punch. John Punch's indentured servitude is extended for the rest of his life. And in essence, he becomes the first real true slave in North America, as he is now basically forced to work for his master for the rest of his life. Now, sadly, Anthony Johnson himself participates in this whole process of actually evolving this idea of indentured servitude towards something more akin to slavery. In fact, in the year 1652, Anthony Johnson takes one of his own indentured servants to court. This man's name is John Casor, and when it comes time for John Casor to be freed after his indentured servitude, Anthony Johnson refuses to free him. Casor is an African man, just like Anthony Johnson, and Anthony Johnson makes the extraordinary claim in court that he never signed an agreement with John Casor to be an indentured servant, and in fact, John Casor is his property. And the court sides with Anthony Johnson. They make John Casor Anthony Johnson's property. Now, if you think about that, it's rather extraordinary. One of the first true slave owners in American history is actually himself an African American man. Now, Anthony Johnson gradually, lives out his life. By the end, he owns about 500 acres of land, which makes him a moderate to wealthy man. He is a very prosperous landowner, a major contributor to his society, and as you can imagine, he's pretty much a kind of regular member of society. But these changes that are occurring, legally speaking, and underneath the surface, are actually undermining Anthony Johnson's own position. When Anthony Johnson dies in 1670, the courts of Virginia step in and refuse to allow his heirs to inherit his property, his children. In fact, the colony of Virginia confiscates all of his property. We know that Anthony Johnson's children and grandchildren remain free, but his grandchildren eventually disappear from the legal record, and we don't know what happens to his family after that, whether they move north and become free African American people or whether they themselves are re-enslaved. But as you can see, in the course of this one guy's life, from 1619 to 1670, you go from being an African man who can actually be freed, can buy property, can own property, can actually have your own servants and things like that, to being in a position where the state will take away your property. Now we have to ask ourselves why this happens, right? What did Anthony Johnson do to kind of deserve this treatment for his heirs? He had played by the rules. He had done everything right. He had been a very prosperous farmer and things like that. Why punish his kids? Well, if you think about it, the very fact that Anthony Johnson is so successful is an increasing threat to the existence of this growing, system of slavery. As slavery becomes more and more profitable, as the colonies require more and more work, hiring white indentured servants or black indentured servants begins to make much less sense. If you can buy African slaves that are your property forever, this is much more profitable for you. Well, when people start to do that, when people start to buy African slaves and say, you are my property, you are mine forever, well, why does somebody like Anthony Johnson therefore become a threat? Well, if you think about it, what are these slaves going to see and think when they see Anthony Johnson and his family and his children being free, prosperous members of society? Well, this idea that to be black means to be a slave is therefore punctured. It's therefore shown to be false. These slaves can view somebody like Anthony Johnson and say, why can I not be like that? Why can't I be free, right? Now, this extends beyond Anthony Johnson as well, because as slavery begins to become more and more essential to the survival of the economy, to the prosperity of the economy, people who don't necessarily fit comfortably in these racial hierarchies therefore become a major problem. This is a big issue, particularly in the Caribbean, down further south from Virginia. Whereas in Virginia, many white English people will come over with their families or will get married to people in Virginia. The climate of the Caribbean is quite dangerous for many Europeans. There's tropical diseases and things like that. And that means that pretty much the only people who come from Europe to work in the Caribbean are usually young white men. There's not very many white women that come with them. They don't stay to raise a family so much in the Caribbean. Many of these people get rich and then will go back to England or France or wherever. Well, that means that a lot of these young, single, white, slave-owning men have, relationships with their slaves. And the resulting children are of mixed race. Their mothers are slaves, their fathers are white slave owners, and you have a lot of mixed race children that kind of exist in the Caribbean world. Well, the interesting thing is that many of these mixed race people are actually freed by their father fathers, and some of them even end up inheriting land and property and become quite prosperous themselves. But they are not given the same legal rights as their white fathers or their white family members are. The idea becomes that even having a single drop of African blood means that you can't be treated legally the same as a white person. Now again, for the same reasons that Anthony Johnson becomes a profound threat, treating these people equally, giving them the same rights as their white parent, or giving them legal rights to kind of participate in government or in the militia or anything like that, therefore kind of undermines this whole idea that's beginning to form that race is the category by which people can be defined, by which people can be kind of stuck into this hierarchy. If you are trying to justify slavery based on race, people like this therefore disrupt and interrupt your whole idea. So mixed race people, freed black people, people like that cannot have the same rights as white people. Otherwise, this whole racial hierarchy thing will come collapsing down. Now, this sets up some pretty serious problems, as you can imagine, right? In many of these colonies, particularly in the Caribbean, but even in North America, if you are a white landowner with a large piece of property, you are going to buy quite a few slaves, right? Well, therefore, it's not going to be long before the ratio of people in your colony is going to be quite out of whack. You're going to have a very large population of black slaves and a very small population of white landowners. And with this increasing kind of racialization of slavery, you can imagine that people are starting to treat their slaves quite badly, right? If you're beginning to view people by race, and race indicates your worth, and your worth indicates your kind of common humanity, you're going to start to treat African slaves harsher and harsher. Now, particularly when these population ratios get so out of whack. Because if you can imagine, if you are a white landowner and you have 20 black slaves, they're not only going to be a source of prosperity for you, but you're going to be terrified of them because there's so many more of them than you. And so, perversely, this actually leads to increasing brutality. If you can keep these slaves fearful, if you can keep them terrified and isolated from one another, they won't join together to rebel against you. This common fear of rebellion is not without warrant, it's not without merit. There are slave rebellions all over the place. Many of them are small, but some of them actually kind of briefly gel together to create serious problems. In 1714, there's one in New York that results in several white people being killed before the militia puts it down. In response, they pass laws that say that black people can't gather in groups of more than 3 or 4. Same thing happens in other portions of the South. In fact, one of the biggest ones is the one pictured here. In 1739, in the colony of South Carolina, a group of slaves is brought there from the Kingdom of the Congo in Africa, and the slave traders make a major mistake. Normally, they would split up people from the same part of Africa, divide them into multiple different plantations, for the basic fact that if they could speak the same language, if they shared the same culture, if they shared any kind of bonds of family or anything like that, they have a reason to fight, and they have the ability to coordinate with one another. Well, by selling this whole group of slaves from the same kingdom in Africa, the Kingdom of Congo, they basically put together a bunch of guys who know how to speak the same language, many of whom were actually trained warriors from the Kingdom of the Congo, and who have no reason not to risk their lives to try to free themselves. So in 1739, these guys rise up, they slaughter their masters, and they actually raid a small armory of arms and begin marching south to try to get to Georgia, which is controlled by the Spanish at this time. They're actually hoping to kind of escape, to get away. Well, they're met by a white militia along the way, and a major battle ensues, and many people are killed. Now, they put down this rebellion, but the fear of such incidents begins to have the perverse effect of, not convincing white people that maybe we should be nicer to our slaves, or maybe we should give them better rights and things like that. It has the opposite effect. In 1740, they begin to pass various acts in South Carolina, which are similar to acts in other parts of North Carolina or North America and also the Caribbean, that strip African people, slaves and free, of the few remaining rights that they have. In fact, the Negro Acts, which are passed in South Carolina in 1740, even say that white slave owners should not teach their slaves English. Now, obviously, many people ignore this because you need to be able to communicate with your slaves, but you can kind of see how fearful people are. People are fearful that if these slaves can speak English, they can actually coordinate with one another and rebel again. So, the problem, therefore, becomes that the profitability of slavery leads to this evolution of ideas. It leads to this increasing racialization of slavery. To be black is to be a slave. And if to be black is to be a slave, then to be black is to be less than the white person, less human even. And this, in turn, leads to this brutal treatment. Well, as you can kind of see, this is a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle that actually creates a kind of compounding problem. As white people become more and more fearful of their slaves, they treat them worse. As they treat them worse, the slaves are more likely to rebel. And as you can imagine, this leads to, increasing violence on the part of white owners. They're going to actually try to break the will of their slaves. They're going to try to break them down, atomize them in a sense, to ensure that they'll never rebel against you. This means that treatment gets harsher and harsher and harsher. Oftentimes, slave traders will divide up families for this very reason, or will abuse family members in front of other ones in horrible ways. All of this is going to be done in order to actually try to completely break the will of these people to resist. But as you can imagine, this has negative consequences. Some people are certainly going to be broken, and some people are certainly going to give up any kind of resistance, but other people are not. And therefore, the fear is going to continue. And as we're going to see as we go forward, this is part of the reason why slavery becomes so difficult to get rid of. It's super profitable. People are afraid of what's going to happen economically if they give up slavery. But even more than that, if you drink the Kool-Aid, if you buy into this idea that these people are somehow subhuman, why do we need to get rid of slavery, right? There's no moral reason to get rid of slavery if these people are subhuman. And then add into that the fact that what's going to happen to us if we free these slaves? Aren't they going to want revenge? The great U.S. politician and third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, summed up this dilemma later on after the American Revolution when he wrote to a friend that the institution of slavery in the United States was kind of like having a wolf by the ears, holding onto a wolf by the ears, right? It's not a great position to be in, to be holding a wolf by its ears. But what's going to happen if you let it go? You might not be comfortable standing there holding onto the ears of the wolf, but in some ways it's preferable to what might happen if you let it go. It may just run away, or it may turn around and kill you. This is the conundrum that many people are going to end up in the 18th and 19th century in the Atlantic world. And as we're going to see, there's justifiable reasons to be afraid that that wolf is going to attack. And we'll talk about that in the coming weeks.